Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about Joel Embiid and the arguments for why he should or should not return for the playoffs this year. We're now going to be switching to NFL, and I wanted to take a look into the 2021 NFL Draft, and in that case, there were 5 quarterbacks selected in the first round, and now just a few seasons later, it is expected that 4 out of 5 of them will be on a different team. So, just as a brief recap, the Jaguars took Trevor Lawrence at number 1. Zach Wilson was taken number 2 by the Jets. The 49ers traded up. I think important to note, they traded up for Trey Lance at number 3. But when they traded for that number 3 pick, they were undecided on who they were going to select. They end up going with Trey Lance, who never pans out there. We had Justin Fields going number 11. The Bears traded up to select him. And then the Patriots were at 15, coming off of Tom Brady leaving, coming off of Cam Newton having a very underwhelming season there in New England. They stay put. They feel like they need a quarterback, so they take Mac Jones, the last available one, and that is how it all shapes out. Now, obviously, none of these moves have been exceptional. Trevor Lawrence is a very good player. He is the closest thing we have had to him being a franchise guy, and I do think that he can be a franchise guy. He delivered a playoff win in a huge comeback against the Chargers during the 2022-23 postseason, but even this year, I think that he is obviously very good, and he also dealt with some injuries down the stretch of the year, but it's interesting because he came in being referred to as the best prospect since Andrew Luck. And if you weren't following the NFL during the 2012 draft, it was Andrew Luck who was the all-time prospect, the can't-miss guy. And I do think it's interesting, brief side note, is the fact that Caleb Williams has been extremely highly touted in this draft, and now we're seeing some other names be thrown into the number 1. I think it's a little bit of the fatigue that comes with the exercise when you have so many people talking about the NFL draft on a daily basis. There were, at times, during that 2012 draft, despite how perfect of a prospect, perfect is probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but how highly touted he was, there were still people arguing for Robert Griffin III, and as time went on, there was a little bit more debate. But at the end of the day, the Colts went with the clear number 1 guy, and it was the right decision for them to make. Now, talking back to this 2021 draft, because the whole point of this exercise is to sort of see how it's going to, see how it played out, and relate some of the factors behind it back to the current upcoming 2024 draft. So I think that when you look at all of these teams, the Jaguars have had 2 head coaches in the time that he's been there. Zach Wilson has had 2 offensive coordinators. Trey Lance was actually in the most stable individual situation, but I do think that there was a different problem there where, from what it sounds like the stories, I don't think we have 100% confirmation, but it appears that Kyle Shanahan was not necessarily in on Trey Lance in this deal, but the front office really wanted it, so there was a lack of full buy-in from the staff as a whole in that instance. I also think that he was probably just overdrafted flat out, but obviously easy to say that a couple years later here. Justin Fields dealt with different offensive coordinators, a very bad situation to walk into in the first place, and that's another team that gave up future assets to go up and get him. And another example with the Patriots, where the coach was not on board. This was clearly an ownership decision that they wanted Belichick to have an actual answer for the quarterback position, so he takes him, but was never really all too welcoming to Mac Jones. And as a whole, we see the results. And the reason I decided to talk about this today was based off of the fact that Zach Wilson was being was given permission to request a trade. Now, what that really looks like, I don't really know. The market for him is likely very minuscule. I don't think that he's going to be a starting quarterback next year. Now, there are a number of teams that could probably benefit from just bringing him in the room, having him develop a little bit more, and not that, again, the expectations for him are necessarily that he ever could be a guy again, but I think a day 3 pick in exchange for someone who was the number 2 overall pick just a few years ago wouldn't be a bad decision necessarily. I'm sort of a sucker for those types of things, and more times than not, we don't see them work out generally when we see the quarterback come in off of being highly drafted and just sort of have them work out in another destination. That is something that we don't typically see. That being said, Baker Mayfield did just play out this season well in Tampa Bay. It's expected that he is probably going to sign another contract there. So, I'm not saying it's impossible. Him and Tannehill are really the only examples, though, and I think it's in large part due to the fact that those first few years of developing a quarterback are just so crucial for their career clock, and if you screw it up then, it leads to a lot of loss of fundamentals, and a lot of the technicality stuff is just all messed up with these teams. If you look at Mac Jones and the way that this is all played out for him, Mac was actually good his rookie season. He was seen as, he in large part, definitely situation is a key thing to look at, but if you are just looking at rookie seasons, I would argue that Mac Jones had a better rookie year than Trevor Lawrence. And obviously, Trevor Lawrence was dealing with a disastrous coaching situation with Urban Meyer, but Mac Jones led a 10-win Patriot team to the playoffs. Granted, a reserve and the Pro Bowl is a joke, but he was a Pro Bowler. And then we just saw the deterioration. I don't think it was for a pure lack of talent. Now, did he ever have the Trevor Lawrence upside? No, but he could have been very solid, but you saw his internal clock literally disappear, where he was put behind this horrendous offensive line. He was throwing to receivers that couldn't get open, and as a result, he was actually panicking in the pocket when he was dropping back to pass, and it led to some really horrific interceptions. Then he was trying so hard at times to not be scared that he would try and force a play that also led to interceptions. So this past year for Mac was terrible. He got benched on multiple occasions for Bailey Zappi, who is no better than him. So I think that it just goes to show, again, a sort of psychological thing that takes place when you are bringing on these young 20-year-olds, early 20s, I should say, to take over your franchise and be the absolute guy. Zach Wilson was given no offensive line. He did have a receiver. I think that he probably had a better situation than Mac Jones did in terms of the offense he played in to begin with, but it's also Jets fans who are just about, and I say this not in a punching down way or anything, they are miserable in the way that their team, their front office, has failed them as a fan base for years now, and they're just sort of sick and tired of everything. And Zach Wilson, who they took with the number 2 pick, never turned out to be the guy, and there was tons of pressure on Wilson. There was also pressure on Mac Jones to, I know that there was a year in between, but to replace Tom Brady as well. And I think that, it's just a couple guys that had talent, but were never able to actually pan out. And they absolutely do deserve some of the blame here, but I think that the organizations do too. And that's why when we come into this upcoming draft class, we have to sort of consider, well, what are the situations for these teams that are looking to select quarterbacks with their initial picks, to trade up for picks? We talked about the Giants yesterday. I think it would be a real mistake for them to trade up for a quarterback in this draft because of the fact that the rest of the team around them, around the quarterback position specifically, is not good enough to really harbor a great situation to come into. I think that in large part, it could sort of, if they were to, play out similarly to the way that the Panthers season went this year, where it's hard to judge the individual quarterback himself based off of the rookie year because of all of the external factors there. And as a result, they were terrible, and they had the number 1 pick that is going elsewhere because of the trade that they made. Now, for that's just specific for the Giants there. I think that would be an example sort of similar to the Bears, possibly similar to the Panthers. And with the Panthers, it's still very hard to fully evaluate the situation. We've seen just 1 year of Bryce Young, and there were tons of people who were very high on Bryce Young coming into last year's draft. He was just about the clear-cut guy. There were people who had CJ Stroud above him, but there was way more love for Bryce Young than concerns. But starting at the top here, the Bears have the number 1 pick. I think that it's a no-brainer that they should move on from Justin Fields because they weren't able to maximize the years that he had in Chicago, and he wasn't able to show enough flash. Now, I thought that he showed potential this season, but at this point, it is a little bit too little too late, where if he made a Jordan Love leap, that it would be a no-brainer. You can get tons of assets back in return for that number 1 overall pick and know that you have a franchise guy. But you have the number 1 pick, not even based off of your own teams not being good enough. They ended up having a decent season at 7-10, and they're not going to be in number 1 positioning again next year. So they should take advantage of this while they can. The quarterback contract clock is a big thing. That's a little bit of a no-brainer. Washington just brought in a new head coach, a new offensive coordinator. I think it is very likely that they should go with a quarterback as well. Now, I don't hate Sam Howell as a player, which maybe makes things interesting. Again, with all of these picks, there is value that you could potentially get out of it, but I think that it probably makes the most sense for them to go with a quarterback here. And I think that they could maybe be a little bit closer to being at least a semi-good team. They were sort of hanging in there before they made trades at the deadline to sort of bottom out. Patriots is another very interesting situation because I think they are further from contention than either of these other 2 teams. They have tons of holes, and that's where it becomes so difficult, I think, with them specifically in terms of whether or not they should hold on to the pick or not. I'm not an expert on the upcoming quarterbacks. You're going to be getting the 3rd quarterback available here. Now, I like Drake May a lot. I know that there are some concerns with the inconsistencies with him, but if it's not him, and if, again, I'm not going to speak too much on the prospects themselves, but anybody here, would they be able to succeed under the circumstances that is currently surrounding the team? I don't really think so. And that's where you have the potential to take a guy to get a fresh start, but is that your biggest need? Is Mac Jones fully, scraps at this point? I think that in New England, it's very likely that he's not going to have any more success, but I still think that there was at least a version of Mac Jones that could have been a very fine quarterback, and I guess we'll never know. But final notes here, there are other teams like the Broncos, like the Raiders, who, if a quarterback falls to them, they might be looking to take a J.J. McCarthy or a Bo Nix in the teens, where it's just, well, we feel like we need a quarterback. There's one here that could be good. Let's take him. I don't know if I agree with that logic. I think that unless you love the prospect, there's probably a reason, and I'm not saying this is always the case, but unless you love the prospect, I think that you just settling for a position you feel like you should be filling is not the right way to go about building a roster. But I guess we'll see how this all plays out in due time. We're going to be taking our final break here. When we come back on the other side, we are going to be finishing up the show with some college basketball talk, so stick with us. We will be right back.